Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the execs and organisers, to Polly and Eleanor for inviting me today. I was really honoured to be invited back to speak at BASEM again. And I said that to Polly and Eleanor, and they said, no, you've misunderstood. This is your last chance to redeem yourself. We've heard lots of talks before from different angles. I'm not a professor, an impressive academic. I don't have the connections that Amit has within the exercise world. I'm basically a jobbing psychiatrist. I see patients in the sports world, and I try to help them to feel and to perform better. I do that across a range of different areas. So I'll be talking today a little bit about the mental health expert panel, which you might be aware of with the EIS. I work with the League Managers Association. I work with UCAD on therapeutic use exemptions for ADHD, and I have a number of private clinics that I'm based at. I work with a charity called State of Mind. I'm a trustee of State of Mind. It's a mental health rugby charity in the NHS locally in Derbyshire. And with Allan and with colleagues, I work with SEPSIG, with the Sports and Exercise Psychiatry Special Interest Group. And it's really good to be back here again at BASEM to make links between our two groups. I think as sports develops an interest in mental health, and also as psychiatrists realise that sports could be a career path for them, I think there's a real nice synergy that we can have between our two groups going forwards. I've worked with a number of different clubs and teams over the years, so my experience is sort of across different areas, as was mentioned, including areas like dance, coaching, as well as athletes in sports teams. This is my disclosure slide. So I thought we'd do a quick recap today, a bit about mental health, mental illness. Apologies if you find this too basic, but I think a lot of learning sort of builds foundations, and we build more complexity upon that. So this is a good chance for me to be reminded of mental health and mental illness. Are they just the opposites? Are they the same thing? Is there a difference? Are they simply opposites from one another? So we all have mental health, and we all have good days and we all have bad days. When you say to yourself, I'm having a bad day, you don't mean my Achilles tendon is sore, or I don't know, my knee's hurting. What you probably mean is I'm feeling stressed. So we all have mental health, and it all fluctuates. Mental health encompasses a range of things. It's the ABC, affect, behavior, cognition. So our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, our ability to solve problems, our social connections and social networks. So mental health and mental illness are not the same thing, and they're also not opposites. They're on a spectrum with each other. The more we look after our mental health, the decreased likelihood of mental illness, and the more we have poor mental health, the increased likelihood of mental illness. These things are on a spectrum, and mental health care should go beyond preventing mental illness, in my view, to promoting good mental health, in the same way we've heard this morning about promoting exercise and exercise interventions. So mental health, mental illness are sort of things that we can do to improve, reduce and increase the risk of one or the other. A biopsychosocial, you've heard that phrase a number of times this morning. So issues that I deal with would be around sleep, diet, pain, injury. I should have concussion on there, particularly in my rugby players. I was talking this morning with a colleague about jockeys and concussion. Psychologically, we will work a lot on resilience and improving someone's strength in advance of the next injury. So you might think of prehabilitation as being a sports medicine thing. I think of it as also being a sports psychiatry thing. You can help someone's mind muscle to be stronger and more resilient in advance of the next injury. Issues around stress management, coping skills, self-esteem. Socially, we're all social animals, as Allan described very well a moment ago. So our relationships, our housing, education, employment, these things are all relevant to ourselves as people, athletes, treating athletes as people. But what do they have to be depressed about? Well, I agree with Allan, what you said a moment ago. Athletes are not unique. There are other stressful professions. I see teachers at Ofsted time, soldiers that have come back from conflict. But I don't think you'd find many groups that are on the front pages of the newspapers as much as sports people, in particular, as you can see, football. Even when the papers are trying to promote positive mental health, they don't quite get it right. I think that's Stormzy, the grime artist. Is that right, Amit? Rather than Romelu Lukaku. That's great Scottish journalism there for you, Alan, isn't it? So we talked a bit about risk factors for mental health. Alan's covered that very well, I thought, so this sort of, I hope, builds on that. Transitions are really important for all of us, whether you're retiring from the NHS after a long career or within sports. Any transitions that we have to make early, so there's condition adjustment disorders, which are basically making a difficult transition, and anything that you have to do, any sudden or sort of life-limiting or career-limiting adjustment is likely to lead to an adjustment disorder. Any transition like that. So retirement that occurs early because of injury is sort of a triple whammy. You also see people throughout their sporting career. You tend to see sort of 3 blips of mental health problems across a sporting career, not making it into the first team, if you like, or not making your ambitions, your trajectory didn't quite hit where you expected, having an early injury or early retirement, and then eventual retirement at the end of a career. There are lots of professional issues that affect sports people, issues around perfectionism we've heard about, performance pressures, selection. A lot of the work we've been doing in the panel, as I mentioned a bit later, have been around selection or deselection issues. Travel and lifestyle, Allan touched on. Depending on different sports, there are issues around different substances which are used, or even different addictions. So I see a lot of gambling addiction in some sports. Other sports, more use of illicit drugs. Other sports, more use of prescribed drugs. So rugby has recently had issues to do with sleeping tablets and Zopiclone. There are issues around the environment, what I think of as ultra-mature environments, and how that affects stigma, and the issues that are in the public domain about different world-class programs, and issues around gender, coach relationships, question mark, bullying. These things are all relevant for professional stresses that could affect an athlete. We've heard a lot about time away in terms of travel, in terms of personal effects, effects on the home life whilst you're away and after you come back. Rugby is a great example of where people often have very short contracts. A lot of the world-class program people have year-to-year contracts, but rugby more so, and often shorter than that. People have a contract until May, maybe the end of the rugby union season. And there's great instability of housing and finances that go with contract problems. There's a few studies here that I wanted to mention in terms of the background prevalence of mental health problems. 3 good studies that I'd recommend taking a look at. Vincent Gutterbach came to speak at a conference that we had in June in Leeds, and this is one of his numerous studies, a 2015 study, looking at the prevalence of anxiety and depression across 5 European countries, studying in this case male footballers of more than 500 people. It was a self-report questionnaire, so maybe prone to some individual or sort of retrospective bias, but the rates of anxiety and depression were more common than seen in the general population between different countries, with Norwegian footballers almost reporting depression more commonly than not. In this study, the highest rates of depression were seen at the highest levels of sport. This next study by Astrid Young, again a study of around 400, this time male and female footballers in Europe. This was assessed objectively with the Centre for Epidemiological Studies rating scale for depression and the GAD-7, and found a point prevalence of 7-8% of depression, comparable to rates in terms of point prevalence in the general population. But in this study, seen more commonly in younger players and associated with injury, with the athletes there having a high injury rate in terms of point prevalence. 2/3 of recognised depression had no formal treatment, and didn't really expand much upon unrecognised depression, which would be a big factor in my experience, particularly male athletes, in my experience, particularly in football. This third study, undertaken by Vincent Gutterbach, looks at 250 footballers and looks at the rate of anxiety and depression, finding it particularly high in retired players. So that third blip of mental health incidents that I mentioned, linked to life events, particularly non-sporting life events around social supports, social networks, and things that could affect any of us as people. So following a theme today, I've stolen Alan Curry's slide again. I thought this was just a nice summary. Compliment, Alan. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And this is a compliment. This is a slide describing, in a real neat one-table slide, the sort of rates of illness that we see across the board in athletes.
Danny Sculthorpe. This guy at times is magic.
So my next slide is of an interview with Danny Sculthorpe, a Wigan, Wakefield, Castleford and England rugby league player who now works with me at the State of Mind charity. Danny speaks a lot about his own mental health difficulties, and we use, in fact, Danny is an asset to the organisation, that we use him as a vehicle to communicate messages to other groups. If we go to Wigan High School and I do a talk, 2 men and a dog turn up, and if Danny turns up, you get a bigger audience. So he's a great speaker. And the next slide is an interview of myself interviewing Danny at a conference.
Yeah, my career ended quite quickly. I prolapsed a disc lifting weights and I got forced into retirement. It was hard, it was very hard because I wasn't ready for it. I was at an age where I should have been hitting my peak as a professional player, and it just got dragged from under me. For a sportsman, we have a lot more highs than the average public. You know, they reckon the average public has 10 highs in a year. We have up to 50. That gets took from underneath you. You have 25, 30 best mates. As soon as you retire, you lose them. You're not with them every day. What Bradford decided to do was rip up my contract. Now, I was a full-time rugby league player from leaving school, and they took that away from me, which meant I lost my job, I lost my career, and eventually when I had two kids and a wife that I couldn't support, I lost my house, and things got really tough, and I started suffering from suicidal thoughts. I couldn't get the thought of suicide out of my mind. Every day should I get in my car, should I wrap it around a tree, should I take loads of pills and drink loads of ale and end my life, because I thought my family and the world would be a better place without me. And then we decided to see my doctor. My doctor was a good friend. He put me on antidepressant medication, which really helped me. But the biggest thing that helped me more than the medication was talking. When I was playing, if I was to tell one of my teammates that I was struggling with mental health, they'd laugh at me. It's hard for an athlete to speak about the problems, because they're worried that they might not get picked at a weekend. What rugby players are always taught is, if they're injured, if there's any weakness, that they don't show it.
So have a little thought, have a little reflection on any themes that you heard about there, and the sort of things we've been talking about. I'm a psychiatrist, so reflection's important, but I'm a sports psychiatrist, so I don't have much time. So we'll move on. So my thoughts were, these are the quotes that I've taken from Danny, and the sorts of things that he mentioned. My career ended quickly, I wasn't ready for it, so transitions, adjustment, sudden or career-threatening adjustments. I prolapsed a disc lifting weights. Again, athletes not unique. There are pressures on doctors, but it's less likely that I'm going to be assaulted at work or injure myself physically than if I'm a rugby league prop forward. A sportsman has more high. I'm sure a sportswoman has more highs too, so there's difference about the highs and lows of sports and the changes of that when someone goes into a subsequent career. I should have been hitting my peak, so issues around perfectionism, as Allan described very neatly there. Perfectionism can be really helpful. A lot of us, including myself, are perfectionists, but if the goals you set for yourself are inappropriately high, combined with excessive self-criticism, then that's a bad combination. I had 30 best mates. When you retire, you lose them, so the social, the occupational role that sport has, which then will be similar to any of the rest of us in terms of being a teacher or a doctor or whatever you do. I was a full-time rugby league player since leaving school, so that ingrained nature, it's all I've ever known. I'm not qualified to do anything else. Often rugby league players, athletes will say to me, although they're not millionaires, if they were to leave their sport, their career earning, their potential for earning would be much less. And if they're going to suddenly leave, they're going to have to work out, how do I replace this chunk of money that I need to pay my mortgage? I was in every day, that got took from under me, so again issues around sudden adjustment, transitions, and also routine, the occupational functioning of the person. And then the last thing I thought was really telling about stigma. If I told a teammate I'm struggling, they'd laugh. The other thing that he mentioned was a rugby league player's taught not to show weakness, and he meant that literally. So in the defensive line, you have 12 or 13 players, and you're taught not to show that you're tired, that you're injured, that you're in pain, because if you're resting or looking tired, they'll run at you. And so as a defensive strategy, that works well, don't show weakness. As a metaphor for mental health, it works very poorly in terms of getting better. And Danny describes very well there that talking was the main thing that helped him cope with the highs and the lows of sport. I'd like to talk a little bit about the mental health expert panel. Allan and I were working last night on the sort of comms for the mental health expert panel, so this is a bit of a preview of that. Or if you're a chief medical officer or performance director or a CEO of any of the world-class programs, you'll be getting some information over the next week a bit about the panel and our role. So we're part of the mental health strategy. There's a wider mental health strategy that predates the panel for what's called the high performance system. This has been developed with a range of stakeholders from UK Sport, English Institute of Sport, the British Athlete Commission across the world-class programmes, and drawing on the mental health charity Mind, which was also mentioned earlier. The aim of the panel and part of the strategy is to promote the high performance system where all people have the best opportunity to have access to mental health care. And again, I guess that phrase positive mental health is not just preventing mental illness, but promoting mental health, and to ensure that there's appropriate support there for people that do have a mental illness. Ensuring that the GB high performance system remains focused and also responsible. So I guess that's starting to touch on the balance between performance aspects, winning medals, achieving funding, and health, staying well, keeping things in proportion, and the tension between those two things. I think the panel will have a role in supporting both of those aspects. This is your mental health expert panel by Professor Allan Curry, the UK's only Professor of Sports Psychiatry. Allan, the world's only Professor of Sports Psychiatry? Yeah, well, I'm going to go with that. The world's only Professor of Sports Psychiatry. As he mentioned, works in a tertiary referral unit at Northumberland Town, and we're an award-winning trust, and we're very fortunate to have him as the chair of the Sports and Exercise SIG. Allan and I started the special interest group 3 years ago in October. Allan's been a great chair for us. Allan also has these great links with the ISSP, so he gets invited to San Francisco for big conferences, and I get to go to Barnsley Rugby Club. Amanda Gatherer, been working with Amanda over the last few months, really fantastic clinical psychologist, also hails from these parts, so she's the chief psychologist for Birmingham NHS Trust, has previously worked with the EIS and with the ECB. That's me at the bottom. I've already mentioned myself. So you'll be aware, as Allan, Amit, and Allan, we are, of course, the A-Team. So Amit, if you're ever looking for a job in sport, you could fit right in.
10 years ago, a crack commando unit was sent to prison by a military court for a crime they didn't commit. These men promptly escaped from maximum security stockade to the Los Angeles underground. Today, still wanted by the government, they survive as soldiers of fortune. If you have a problem, if no one else can help, and if you can find them, maybe you can hire the A-Team.
I just like the tune, I just thought I'd show that tune. So if you have a problem, we might be the people that can help you. Our work to date has been based around the 4 pillars of the EIS's mental health strategy: education, provision, assurance, and communication. So we're working on raising the level of education, of information, of knowledge, experience around mental health. There's already been mental health first aid training used in a lot of the world-class programs. We're developing video tutorials and CPD modules, building on existing CPD work that Allan and Amit have both done. Provision. So we've been working with a number of the world-class programs of the GB teams. Very often it's a systematic issue. Might be an issue around risk assessment and self-harm. Might be an issue around selection, deselection. Might be an issue around a historical case, an athlete that an athlete that presented with a challenge, you should say, that helped the program to develop learning. I'd like to further that. Or it might be sort of a live case, a current athlete with an issue. Assurance, so we've been looking at these systematic issues, as I said, deselection, selection, risk management, and communication across the board with all of our stakeholders. If no one else can help, so we're part of a large multidisciplinary team, the team behind the team. maybe we're the team behind the team behind the team, and I think we have a role in supporting, my own view, might be slightly controversial, my own view, I think we have a role in supporting the team behind the team, as well as the team. And by that I mean, whenever I worked in any department, in any club, you end up supporting the staff, the coach, the dentist, the owner's daughter. I think of the groups that I work in as sort of the family, for example, the Bradford Bulls family, and thinking about how you support the team behind the team so you can support the team. I'm not sure who supports the team behind the team behind the team, but I talk to Allan when I get stuck. The EIS already has obviously a great network, 21 sports medicine doctors, 96 physiotherapists, 30 performance psychologists and 28 performance lifestyle advisors, coaching staff. The athletes will already have their peer support networks, their informal sources of support. It's already a system which will be aware of referring athletes largely to the Priory through the BUPA or the Athlete Medical Scheme. Other services exist. People refer to me, people refer to Cognacity. And of course there's NHS Care, although Allan mentioned some of the difficulties there with an athlete maybe falling between primary and secondary care. Almost sort of too complex for primary care, not complex enough for secondary care, and they might fall between those two services. And if you can find them. So how do you make a referral? So referrals are currently being managed through James Bell, himself a performance psychologist, Dr. James Bell, the EIS as head of mental health, and also continuing his previous role as the head of culture at UK Sport. The types of referrals we're getting are complex cases requiring this MDT input, and one of the GB teams, Amanda and I, worked together because the person had a range of issues around prescribing and their bipolar disorder and their ASD, and issues around trauma and their personality. So this, at times whereby we need to work as an MDT to manage complex people, and that's the type of work I really enjoy. And so really that's a little bit about the panel. I'm going to mention a bit about risk assessment, but really I'm going to flip that on its head going forwards from now. So I'm going to briefly mention sport as a risk factor, and the rest of my slides are around kind of sport as a treatment, if you like. So there are studies looking at sport as a risk factor for suicide or for self-harm. A study by Gunn in 2014, a large study of 6,500 what they called adolescent athletes, found it's really differential between different sports. Some sports are protective for suicide and self-harm. They found team sports. Individual sports are less protective. And what they called, I don't know if it's a 2014 thing, but they called sports outside of gender norms. Examples they gave were male cheerleading and female wrestling, the two examples that they studied. And they found that rates of self-harm and of suicide are higher in the sports that they called sports outside of gender norms. But I'm now going to flip that on its head and talk a bit about, actually before I do that, something to note. You'll be familiar with these 4 people. And it's a slide I often use and present because 2 of these people spoke about their mental health and are still with us, and 2 of these people did not speak about their mental health and are no longer with us. But I now want to flip that on its head, if that's okay, and you think about sport as a vehicle for suicide prevention. It's more looking at it from a public health angle, thinking about the work of State of Mind, which is about using athletes and facilitating athletes as a vehicle to communicate mental health messages to the general public. So I don't have Amit's connections with Arsenal in the Premier League. This is my Vanarama Conference League 7 connections with Chesterfield FC. But we've done World Suicide Prevention Day events each year in Derbyshire for the last 4 or 5 years now. What is World Suicide Prevention Day, you might ask? So this is an international day of significance which has been going since 2003, organised by the International Association of Suicide Prevention and the World Health Organization, and it's used to raise awareness, to tackle stigma, to reduce suicides, and particularly to target high-risk groups. For example, men. You'll be aware that men have 3 times the rate of suicide versus women, so 75% of suicides occur in men. There's a great social media presence around that time, so it's on the 10th of September each year, and the nearest football match to the 10th of September in Derbyshire for the last few years, we've held events around World Suicide Prevention Day. If you're interested, the hashtag is WSPD and then the year. So men, who are we? So men are overrepresented in suicide statistics. As I said, we're 3/4 of suicides, and we're underrepresented in health seeking. as in we don't seek help as effectively, as readily as women. So about half the population, but about 3/4 of suicides. In Derbyshire, in 2015, men represented 85% of all completed suicides. So Derbyshire took that worrying statistic and sort of built on it. In a nutshell, if you want me to sort of summarise that, you don't always find us at healthcare centres, you might find us in other places. So State of Mind do a lot of work in barber shops and taxi ranks and working men's clubs, as well as in rugby matches. So we built gradually our work over the last few years in terms of the people that we approached. In 2015 we had a market stall. We then worked out the value of sport and using Derbyshire County Football Club, Chesterfield FC, and then also Alfreton FC. It's gone from my mind. Another great football club. And Belper FC, thank you, Belper FC. And Sheffield FC, the world's oldest football club. If you're interested in that, the world's oldest football club. In Johnston in Derbyshire, we've reached more and more people, and I've got to meet more and more strange people dressed up as animals. So this is Rami the Ram, on the bottom right-hand corner. This is a public health slide, which shows the team that you would want. If you're away at Paris Saint-Germain, there's 5 minutes left. This is who you want to bring off the bench in terms of suicide prevention strategies. So real wide, have a look at that slide, a real wide MDT of people from faith leaders to working with the coroner's office and how they process and manage and relate to bereaved family members. Support for those who are bereaved by suicide is a really important factor. We tried to build on this slide and to get as much of that as we could with our team. So this is Chester the Mouse, and our work at both Derbyshire and at Chesterfield, working with the National Suicide Prevention Alliance, the Samaritans, Mind, Cruise Bereavement Care, the County Council, the Healthcare Trust, etc. So I've been waffling on about it for a while. What did you actually do? Well, we assembled our team, an MDT of all these different groups, and we went to football matches. And we stood outside football matches for an hour and a half or 2 hours before the match, and we handed out Z cards, so credit card sized cards the person can take away. On these cards were sort of public health messages, issues around sleep, appetite, promoting mental health. We also had a research survey that was linked on the Z cards. We had a QR code that could take you to filling out a survey. And in the last couple of years, we worked out that we wanted the person that took the card to keep the card. So we put the fixture list on the back of the Z card, and the person held onto the card. And in 2016, a man came up to me and said that he'd met me in my jeans and t-shirt. And in 2015, I'd given him a card in the June time at a State of Mind event, and he'd gone home, developed depression, thought about ending his life over the winter of 2015-16. And as he was in the kitchen about to do that, he saw this little card in the corner of the room, picked up the card, phoned his GP, started antidepressants, went for therapy, got better, and then waited until the following June to see if I'd be standing at Headingley. And he was going to come and tell me this story. So it's remarkable sometimes how little interventions that we can do can make a big difference. And also as a clinician, you know, that will happen to all of us frequently, but there's something different about doing it in your jeans and t-shirt with a large mouse in Chesterfield. So we have one-to-one conversations. We meet with people. Some are very brief. Hi, it's World Suicide Prevention Day. Some a bit more detailed. You find a bloke will say, I have a bit of that, by which they often mean, I have depression. You might get into conversation with them. Sometimes we've had much longer conversations. At the Derby match in 2016, a man came to see the match who was bereaved the following night, the previous night. So his wife died on the Friday. It's not me. So his wife died on the Friday, and on the Saturday he woke up and he went to the football. He went to see Derby County because that's what he always does, and that's part of his routine. And he was clearly distressed. He was able to access expert Samaritans counselling at that time. We often get the clubs to support us. They give us a signed shirt. We get a queue of people to win a raffle for the signed shirt. Then we hit them with a survey whilst they're queuing. So you can do lots of different things, lots of biopsychosocial things to help with suicide prevention. This is the survey I mentioned for 2017. So we had 137 people that we surveyed in terms of who goes to a football match or who answered the survey. It was 58% male, average age of 43. And some of these stats really stand out in terms of the number of people that had experienced suicidal thoughts, or the number of people who knew at least one person who died by suicide. And there could be a selection bias in this, in that you're more likely to answer a survey about suicide prevention if you've been affected by suicide prevention. But a lot of these people, as I said, were queuing up, waiting to get a signed shirt, and we surveyed them and not knowing anything about them. So I think this shows really how much suicide can affect whole communities and whole groups of people, and how a very high proportion of people will know someone who's been affected by self-harm or suicide. So that's the end of the presentation. The take-home messages. Mental health, mental illness, they're on a spectrum, they're not just opposites, they're not necessarily the same thing, but they relate to one another. The more we work on mental health, the less mental illness we'll find. Treatment should go beyond just treating mental illness to promoting mental health, just like we've seen in the exercise model. The number of risk factors for mental illness in sport, particularly around transitions, personal and professional sporting issues. Mental illness is at least as common in sport versus the general public across a range of conditions as we saw. And we saw a case example of the highs and lows of professional sport. We now have the mental health expert panel, and I hope that our work's going to expand and grow, looking at the mental health strategy, working with the wider MDT as part of the EIS, and looking at those areas of our strategy: education, provision, assurance, and communication. Suicide prevention. Sport can be a risk factor. Sport can be a treatment for athlete suicidality, and it can also, sport can be a vehicle. Sport can be a vehicle for public health strategy, for helping with mental health and suicide prevention in the wider community. If you're interested in what we've had to say, then it'd be great to get your interest in our Royal College Psychiatry group. That's our hashtag, and a number of sports medics have come along as guests or speakers to our twice yearly conferences. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll just get a drink.